Right, Thunderbolt, let's go!
Pokemon has been an essential part of our childhood, ever since we got to witness Ash and his friends go on adventures along with his Pokemon companion, Pikachu. Over the years, various media have expanded this lore, each one as colorful as the last. But in the midst of all these colors and these joyful arcs, some dark elements have not been explored at all. Let's take a look at all the dark pages in the hidden chapters of Pokemon, and we have been lured into a colorful world away from these stories. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Cubone's Mask of Mourning. There are many interesting parallels between real-world creatures and Pokemon, based on more than just appearance. Durant and Luxray literally look like they are a cross between two real creatures from the animal world. But then there are the parallels between the unique traits of these creatures, which offer an interesting and darker perspective on how real these creatures can become. Cubone, a Pokemon adored by many of its fans, wears the skull of its dead mother, making the skull a symbol of dread that serves as a perpetual reminder. It's nature's brutal hierarchy that is clearly on display with this creature. And apart from that, there's the cry that it makes, which echoes through the night, which might sound aggressive but holds a lot more weight than that. Nature can be brutal, and we find sufficient harsh truths in real-world creatures to help us explore this. The praying mantis consumes her mate after reproduction, resulting in a savage cycle that proves the coexistence of affection and annihilation. But in the case of Cubone, it's almost as if the tragedy that the creature goes through is not just fantasy, but a reflection of both the origin of the beast and the burden of inheritance through the pain of loss. It's not merely the idea that such a creature exists in nature with a dark origin that makes this beyond our comprehension, but the fact that even through the thinnest vein of affection, there exists some violence at the core. It's the wound that shaped this animal and its idea of survival. Drifloon and other Pokemons bond with children. If you thought that was dark, then you haven't really met some of our least child-friendly Pokemon yet. Drifloon appears to be a balloon and drifts through the air, chilling by itself. But the Pokédex entry for this one doesn't really sound very relaxing. According to the entry, Drifloon lures children by grabbing their hands and tries to carry them away. So, deep in the fun-filled world of Pokemon, there's literally a creature that tries to use the curiosity of a child as a means of making a fatal transaction. But that's just one of them. There are a few others who have themes that really make you question the origin of some of the Pokemon. Take Banette, which appears to be a doll, but behind its face lies the theme of abandonment and resentment against the one who discarded it. This Pokemon is entirely driven by hatred towards its previous owner. And if you think that's still understandable, then there's Mimikyu for you. If Mimikyu ever appears in the live-action projects, then it might be the one that haunts us the most in the midst of all the horrors that this world exhibits. Similar to the previous Pokemon, this one basically uses the ragdoll version of Pikachu as a disguise for something that is much more sinister and terrifying. So the next time you think a Pokemon is cool enough to be captured using your phone, better make sure it doesn't end up taking you away, luring you to a darker fate. Yamask. Faces we leave behind. If you think Dawn to Dawn is the only time we had the chance to see some really bizarre and crazy ghosts, then you should take a second glance at Yamask. When looking into the spirits in this world, Pokemon managed to peek it using the Generation 5 Pokemon that might not have been a result of a mutation or some other biological experiment, but death itself. So the mask that you see on the Yamask is none other than the face that this spirit used to have when it was human. At first glance, it does appear to render some sort of facial features, but that's not all of it, because that face is supposed to be a literal human face. What makes it more disturbing is that, apart from carrying the mask, the Pokédex notes that the Pokemon retains memories of its former life, and there are moments when the face appears to be crying, and that means nothing but the fact that the creature is actually remembering its time as a human and longs to have that form. Even though the idea of the Pokemon itself is disturbing, the fact that children can capture this Pokemon, essentially the spirit of a dead person, and then force it to fight battles is even more unsettling. But Yamask isn't the only example of such darkness, because there's also Kadabra's Fire Red, which is supposed to be a boy with extrasensory powers who ended up waking up as a Pokemon one morning. Meanwhile, Gengar was once a human, Frostlass is said to be the soul of a woman, and, last but not least, the scary Phantump are believed to be tree stumps possessed by the spirits of children who died in the forest. Their fates and tragic stories don't stray far from the absolutely devastating and dark tale of Nina Tucker in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Haunter's Choking Kiss. The Haunter pretty much sticks to its name as it's associated with a behavior that can be labeled as a mix of playfulness and predation. Almost like something waiting for the prey, Haunter waits in the dark corners for people to come, and then it would end up licking them with its gaseous tongue. And what would the fate of someone who got licked be? Well, it could be anything from paralysis to even death if exposed to a more extended period of time. So the smiley face holds a misty tongue behind it, and yet there's malice. It's bizarre to imagine how the players pick their Pokemon because, so far, it's clear that some of them can be really dangerous even to be near. The ones we discussed so far are very clear about their behavior and can be understood, but what makes the Haunter distinct is the ambiguity of its appearance. Most of the previous Pokemon would only attack based on some sort of past vengeance or merely because they target children, but Haunter doesn't have a reason to target someone. So, using its dangerous tongue is not supposed to be a wound or weapon, but merely a source of amusement for itself. So anyone going for the creepy smile might not realize what lies underneath. In contrast, those intending to be friends must go through some significant moments of fear, fascination, and fatal curiosity. The ethics of Pokemon battles. One of the most significant aspects of the larger narrative in Pokemon is the battles. The tournaments where flashy fights occur and the recognition Pokemon owners receive for their wins. In fact, it is the central part of the arc, and that's why we never really take a deeper look into it to understand how the entire event might look in a different light. Once you get rid of the colors and the music, these battles are basically reduced to more of a stylized blood sport where two creatures are made to combat each other for the sake of their human owners. The visuals are softened, with injuries and blood hardly making an appearance, but that doesn't prevent comparisons to dogfighting or cockfighting. Even though there's the idea of consent, it isn't really well established because even though the Pokeball looks like an invitation, it's more of a containment. Once they capture the Pokemon, it undergoes a bonding process, where the terms taming, training, and obedience become key players, while the process itself is more about domestication and dominance. The combatants don't get to raise a voice or even speak up based on their present scenario, and the idea of refusing to comply doesn't really appear to be an option at all times. In the real world, cockfights and other such sports are condemned because of the suffering that is clearly visible on the creatures. In turn, the same thing is softened in these battles, where instead of showing damage, there's the cry of pain and fainting due to injury instead of dying. It is absolutely sinister how the show manages to cover up this darker shade and create a reasoning that fits into the viewer's minds, unless they choose to view it from a different perspective. Mentions of death in the Pokédex. The Pokédex is intended to be a library, a scientific instrument that records information in the form of a digital encyclopedia about Pokémon. It holds information regarding their traits, theoretical behaviors across different species, and isn't very far from the idea of having a phone that can access such data. What's particularly exciting about this data is the format in which it is presented, with information reading like field notes, giving brief information that could be applied instantaneously. But the same Pokédex is also a repository of myth, superstition, and even death, which somewhat distances it from the scientific angle. Many of the records here are unnerving and can be considered a fatal detail that hints at how the Pokemon world is also wrestling with mortality. With some of the Pokemon that we had discussed before, the Pokédex holds some myths that can be the most ghastly things you find about that world. Walking into this lore might actually prove worse for you or make you subject to the reality that you might not be interested in while looking to capture some Pokemon. The colorful tone the device tries to maintain is another attempt to hide the darker nature of the world it becomes a window for. Lavender Town's Haunting Echoes. Lavender Town has been clearly established as a haunted town from the very beginning in the Pokemon world. In a journey to explore this world, with all its colors and cheerful people and places, Lavender Town appears as a silent town wrapped in pale fog and bizarre funeral music. Some might think it's just pure creepiness as a town, but then there's the Pokemon Tower, a cemetery dedicated to all the fallen Pokemon companions. It's the only place in the lore that references the death of the Pokemon. In the games, one can actually witness these ghosts appear as pixelated shapes of horror, and they cannot be identified or fought. Meanwhile, The ghost of a Marowak awaits, the one that was killed by Team Rocket as it tried to protect the Cubone. Even though the lore has hinted at the place many times throughout the games, what made it darker was the cultural myth surrounding it. Various legends have been created about the place, including stories of children who were driven mad by the music here and led to their deaths. Even though a deeper dive clarifies that none of that is really true, the place has indeed become a mark of the interruption in innocence, symbolizing the mortality and grief that exist in this otherwise colorful world. The brutal Mega Evolution process. One of the most anticipated events in the show has always been the evolution of Pokemon to a different stage, with all the colors and shine making the moment as glorious as possible. A radiant surge of energy ends up binding the trainer and the Pokemon, and even though it looks like the next big thing in terms of your Pokemon, it's actually rather disturbing if you dig deeper into the process. The Mega Evolution process requires something like a Keystone and a Megastone so that the energy could be channeled between the trainer and the Pokemon, resulting in this explosive metamorphosis. What's really happening inside the Pokemon is much more gruesome, as its body expands and its physiology warps. At the same time, the instincts distort around it, and even though we don't even get to witness a hint of this process, it's relatively straightforward that it might just be the most agonizing thing to put someone through. The Pokédex notes that the Mega Gyarados had to undergo energy bursts in its brain vessels, thus making it prone to some really uncontrollable rage. Meanwhile, Mega Aerodactyl actually gets overwhelmed by the power that ends up coursing through its veins. And maybe that's the precise explanation for the fierceness of these Pokemon. Meanwhile, the greatest danger of these is the Mega Charizard X and Mega Mewtwo X, both of whom don't hold back on their obsession and heightened aggression, resulting in some fundamental psychological instability that goes beyond some mere evolution. Pokemon Delicacy. Another disturbing event that actually matches up with real-world circumstances. A duality that stands out in the otherwise colorful and playful world of Pokemon. While coexistence is a central theme when the characters go around and find newer Pokemon each and every time, in the midst of all that, there are moments of consumption that will make you feel forced to look again. The civilization somehow manages to lure you into its beauty through the character designs and their depiction in familiar locations. Still, it has a central contradiction playing in the back. While the Pikachu is a constant partner in the battles, a Farfetch'd might just be getting roasted for dinner somewhere. This is not something that has been discovered as an illegal activity. Still, the Pokédex entry of Farfetch'd mentions that it is a rare Pokemon that can make for a delicious meal, and it has been hunted to near extinction because of the leek that it carries. It's not only limited to this one creature, because we also have the likes of Basculin, Goldeen, and Magikarp, who are referenced as edible fish, even though some of them are labeled as difficult to eat. Now, in a society, it makes sense that this duality exists, but then the Pokemon world doesn't just reduce the Pokemon to mere pets, they are also companions with emotions, loyalty, and grief, amongst other things like soldiers, friends, and partners, but they are also reduced to the idea of livestock. So the same hand that asks them to go for combat is also the one that ends up butchering them. Yeah. Another dark chapter in the world of Pokemon that is treated as a joke. Preventing Pokemon evolution. Pokemon evolution is an essential part of the lore. With each evolution, the Pokemon experiences emotional growth, an increase in its emotions and powers, and a rise in aggression. So, often when the cutest of the Pokemon go through their evolution, they lose their innocence and become better companions to go for combat. Even though this process is not entirely under control, there are ways to prevent it. And it seems that prevention is being actively implemented to keep a particular aesthetic for the Pokemon. The act might sound like something that is not entirely in control of the trainers, but they can use Everstones and interrupt specific animations to halt the process and almost make it seem as though it is kindness in disguise. But the implications for halting this natural process could be at a significant cost to the Pokemon, something that we are never really made to understand. Each time the body of the Pokemon builds itself for the massive energy process, and each time it is prevented, it causes an unnatural stasis. So instead of allowing for a natural process, the trainers revoke this, making it almost as if the Pokemon are basically beings who have subsumed their desires under the will of the humans. Pokeball brainwashing. The Pokeball, over the years, has become one of the biggest toys from the franchise. It is seen as a tool for control, capable of efficiently compressing a living creature into a portable form and restoring it under command. But if you look deeper into the technicality of this process, it is merely a human-controlled cycle of confinement, where the idea of bond is just a mask for a coercive relationship. There are certain moments we witness, such as trauma from separation. At the same time, the Pokemon are confined, mistreated, and overwhelmed by anger stemming from abandonment. But all of this suffering becomes the background texture for adventure, and thus, the creature's choices, and even its life, are put through the coercive system. The Lumio Station Mystery. Following in the footsteps of the Lavender Town lore, another mystery has managed to remain one of the most eerie and unsolved fragments in the Pokemon mythology. Situated right inside the glittering heart of the Kalos region in Lumio City is the station where, under specific circumstances, a particular phenomenon inside the elevator causes the player to experience something very eerie. When the elevator doors close, the screen fades. As the player regains control, a woman appears behind them, absolutely silent and pale, with motions that starkly contrast with the general animation of the game. Now, the next move is what makes it a lot more creepy, as she slowly moves in and whispers, "No, you're not the one," into the player's ear and then disappears. While earlier, there were rumors of it being merely a glitch, once you experience it, it becomes clear that this is as scripted as any other moment from the game. In fact, over the years, there have been various details that have been attached with this character, linking her to the battles of the years past, and also making it appear as though it is tied to Az, the immortal king of Kalos. In a town that has been built on top of the ruins of the war, the idea of a figure that appears and waits for the ideal candidate isn't something entirely unique. It becomes a figure that reminds the city and its people of the days they saw before the colors took their place. Pokemon War. Not entirely theory. Now we might be entering the category of events that have been significant in some fan theories, yet somehow managed to include minor details referencing the possibility of an important historical event associated with this world. There are hints or memories of a conflict that haunt the backdrop of the games and the animated series, but it is never really pointed out or discussed loudly. The first time this idea was hinted at was during the first generation games, where the world had an unusual balance between adults and orphans, along with a large number of young trainers roaming this world. The children are sustaining everything from the economy to the infrastructure, and they seem to be rebuilding it through a ritualized, non-lethal combat. And yet, nothing is really said about this weird absence and presence. In fact, one of the only clues comes from Lieutenant Surge, the gym leader at Vermilion City, who had once stated, "Hey kid, what do you think you're doing here? You won't live long in combat, not with your puny power. I tell you kid, electric Pokemon saved me during the war." Now for the first time when you hear that, it sounds like there's a lot that we don't really know about this world. But then you add up the details and it all starts making sense somehow. The absence of fathers, the idea of uniforms and hierarchy, and formalized combat point towards a culture heavily shaped by a conflict deeply rooted in its history. Some more explicit references include regions like Galar and Kalos, the later of which is a version of France, and it discusses a war that took place 3,000 years ago through the Arc of Az. The war could have utilized the Pokemon as a significant weapon and, over time, figured out how to make the most of them once the war was over. Instead, we ended up with the instruments that paved the way for the tournaments and the Pokeballs. So the next time you're exploring a town in this lore, try to look at it through the lens of a city that is trying to get rid of its history. Maybe you will also find things that have never really been talked about here. Fossil Pokemon. Various stories are associated with the origins of the Pokemon. While some of them are absolutely dark and ghastly, others make it appear as though some of them are being brought back from the dead to participate in these tournaments and combat for their trainers. Some of these Pokemon are resurrected from ancient remains using technology that is supposed to simulate de-extinction, thus breaking the thin line between archaeology and necromancy. Even though the game terms these circumstances as a revival, it is clear that a reanimation process of these extinct life forms is at play, which doesn't seem to make sense in the larger ecological or evolutionary logic. The Pokemon like Kabutos, Aerodactyl, Tyrantrum, and Arctozolt embody specific triumph and also hints towards some level of ethical distortion. While most of the other Pokemon are supposed to have a natural growth, these are absolutely dependent on human intervention for their existence. Much worse are the cases of Arctovish and Dracovolt, amongst others, who seem to push this experimentation to the absolute grotesque levels. So even though these Pokemon can be rather enjoyable for the kids, it is pretty clear that this is nothing less than the instrumentation of the dead. Pokemon enslavement. Now, over the past few details, there have been many things that have clearly adhered to how there's a lot more than mere human notions to the Pokemon. They seem to be sentient beings who feel camaraderie with their human companion, which becomes increasingly apparent during the Pokemon fights. But if you look at some of the Pokemon that roam around freely in their vibe, doing their own things, it almost appears as though the idea of companionship wasn't entirely something that most of them might even strive for. The term, "gotta catch 'em all," is used to capture Pokemon and put them in Pokeballs, which has more profound implications that need to be discussed separately. The trainers seem to sympathize with the Pokemon and develop a bond with them. However, the fact that they are enslaving them appears to be rationalized in their minds as a way of showing affection and engaging in a process of mutual growth. But the fact that the larger systems in society strictly manage to keep a power imbalance between the Pokemon and the trainers, who are humans, is very much evident. Marvelous verdict. Pokemon has seen various interpretations over the years, but I am waiting for a version that will delve deeply into the cracks in the lore and explore what exists behind the tournaments and the larger politics at play here. Detective Pikachu does have an interesting point of view in that matter, as we see how sentient and in pain the Pokemon are at times. However, the larger idea of making them appear cute and aesthetically pleasing eliminates any chances of highlighting the darker elements. It isn't surprising that there's a larger suppressed lore behind the entire franchise, as it would make for an amazing arc later. Maybe the battles are interpretations of a real war, and this world is not the utopia that it tries to be. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe, and thanks everyone.